17. Thank you. We now come to the 10-minute rule motion. I say that with a degree of interest because it means that the honourable gentleman has only up to 10 minutes in order to articulate his case, which I feel sure he will do with an eloquence worthy of Demosthenes. 10-minute rule motion, Mr. Tim Loughton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for that hint. I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill to establish a Rail Ombudsman to scrutinise performance and complaints and represent the interests of passengers, to make provision for the Ombudsman to levy fines on train operating companies for late running and cancellation of trains and about the use of such fines and for connected purposes. And how on earth to do that within 10 minutes, given the shambles of GTR, is a wonder. However, Mr. Speaker, the GTR franchise covering Southern Rail isn't working. Notwithstanding the current problems with industrial action, incompetent management and Department for Transport failings, which have been aired all too frequently in this House, the system for pursuing complaints and achieving financial or other redress is simply not fit for purpose. So my bill would apply to the whole UK rail network, and whilst not intended as a silver bullet to resolve the problems of Southern, should go some way to disincentivising complacency over consistent failure to operate a decent service when some form of normality actually returns to our rail service, for those happy days of some form of normality in the southern region. The truth is, Mr. Speaker, that when things go wrong on the railways, train operating companies can actually benefit. There are two types of compensation payments at present. The so-called Schedule 8 payments from Network Rail to the train operators when something goes wrong with them, with the infrastructure, for example, points failures, or the notorious signal box fire at Penge in Reggie Perrin's day. This is designed to compensate train operators for the impact of poor performance on their revenue and helps reduce the risk premium factored into franchise bids. But extraordinarily, Mr. Speaker, the train companies are not required to pass on the compensation they receive this way to the passengers who actually suffer the inconvenience and loss. It's been estimated that some 60% of rail compensation comes in this form, and it was calculated by the Social Market Foundation last year that the train operators raised £107 million from Network Rail for delays, whilst passengers received just £26 million of that, meaning the train operating companies profited by some £81 million. Now, the second form of compensation is that directly paid out by the train operators to the passenger, where they are themselves liable for delays and cancellations caused by staffing problems, rolling stock breakdown and so on. The problem is that this depends specifically on passengers lodging a claim, which can be very bureaucratic and often rejected on technicalities. And the take-up rate for claims is very low. Whilst recent events on Southern have changed that a fair bit, it's from a low base, and in 2014 the Office of Rail and Road Regulator calculated that only 11% of passengers always or usually claim compensation. Subsequently that's increased to around 35%, but it's still a minority. So if passengers do not claim, the train operators like GTR actually benefit, and on strike days when they've reduced salaries and energy costs to pay, they can actually profiteer as well. Now, GTR's turnover is around £1.3 billion, over £1 billion of which comes from central government to run the train service. Yet in a parliamentary question earlier this year, the then Rail Minister stated that just £2 million has been levied against GTR in respect of cancellation and short formation performance benchmarks, while some £2.2 million was paid out to passengers under the Passengers Charter and Delay Repay Compensation. So that's a total of just 0.4% of turnover, and hardly an incentive, and that's before netting off the payments to GTR from Network Rail. Added to which, all train operators have different schemes and methods of compensating. There's no industry benchmark. This is hardly an incentive to run an efficient service, and there must be a better way of doing it. And with 47 million passenger journeys cancelled or significantly late last year, this is a big problem affecting many regular travellers, our constituents. Added to which, we need a much more effective awareness programme alerting frustrated passengers to what their rights actually are. And there's certainly no sign of that being done by the train operators themselves. And the problem currently is that the passenger can like it or lump it. The complaints procedure largely relies on the goodwill of the train operating company beyond the minimum delay repay obligations if they accept the application at all. And as the consumer champion Which have put it, the current complaint handling landscape in the rail sector is inadequate. There are major gaps in the provision of alternative dispute resolution with no effective route for redress and escalation of complaints if a train company does not resolve a complaint. And Transport Focus, which handles some complaints informally, has no ability to impose binding decisions, no power to resolve complaint appeals, and this is not an appropriate body to deliver alternative dispute resolution. That's why Which believes the government should establish a Transport Ombudsman. ombudsman as I'm proposing. And it's extraordinary, frankly, that there is currently no ombudsman system for rail complaints. This could and should have been introduced at the same time as the Consumer Rights Act of 2015 extended to rail companies, giving passengers the same legal protection they receive when paying for any other service or goods, and improves their ability to obtain redress beyond the current duty threshold, delay thresholds, and specifically receive it in actual cash rather than travel vouchers. So what will my bill do, Mr. Speaker? I know you're desperate to know. Well, firstly, it will overhaul the compensation scheme, creating a much tougher financial impact on train operating companies and a fairer and easier way of compensating passengers with a more reliable reflection of the inconvenience and costs they have suffered. Every time a train is late beyond an agreed threshold or cancelled altogether, in advance or at short notice, or overruns a station, a penalty fine will be paid into a central pot, independent of the train operator and before affected passengers having to claim. Passengers will then be able to claim directly from that pot, but in a much more simplified way. And last week I met a company that's devised the technology where regular passengers can download an app, track their arrival at stations, automatically lodge a compensation claim where appropriate, and the compensation will be paid directly into a bank account without any paperwork having to be lodged. And this app goes live in January, and by automating an unwieldy claims process will also reduce administration charges for the train operators. And the Office of Rail and Road Super Complaint Response Report gave a range of estimates for manual processing of claims between £1.80 and £39 per claim, which is extraordinary. So I know the Minister has promised automated refunds to a payment card, but that is still some years away and is fraught with verification problems, whereas this technology is available now. Secondly, the penalty pot will be used to help fund a new beefed-up Rail Ombudsman I'll come on to in a minute. And thirdly, any remaining funds will be used to offset fare rises, thereby giving a further payback to inconvenienced and hassled passengers. Whilst this new scheme is no silver bullet alone, it would recalibrate the balance of power back to aggrieved passengers, incentivise the train operator to stop running a shoddy service, and instil a sense of urgency in them to get problems sorted out. Now, the second part of my bill, Mr. Speaker, would establish a new Rail Ombudsman with real teeth and proper statutory powers. This is based on practical proposals discussed with Ombudsman services and which have now been endorsed by the consumer watchdog Which, who said yesterday the government must introduce a new ombudsman that all train companies have to sign up to so that passenger complaints are properly heard and resolved, and they're subsequently supporting this bill. It would be based on the Energy Ombudsman model, which is already in operation and could be adapted in the rail sector to deal with both the train operating companies and Network Rail, also helping to clarify responsibility for passenger problems in any given instance. The introduction of a Rail Ombudsman would help level the playing field between passengers and rail operators by establishing a strong independent second tier of redress, and a Rail Ombudsman would not only greatly enhance the level of redress available to passengers, but also help to improve confidence in the rail sector, something which is currently sorely lacking in the southern region in particular. That Rail Ombudsman would take up and resolve individual complaints and direct compensation. It would also oversee the operation and thresholds of the penalty pot I've described, and it would also need to award compensation based on realistic levels of actual loss suffered by passengers. Typically under Direct Repay 15 now, passengers can claim just 25% of the cost of single fares. And of course the Minister recently announced 1 month's compensation for long-suffering passengers, but 1 month's refund on a season ticket doesn't go far when you're having to pay for nights of stay in London or taxis back late at night from Three Bridges to the Sussex coast when you find yourself stranded. It would also collect and analyse data to identify frequent and common problems with individual operators and be able to direct them to make remedies or suffer forfeits. And the Rail Ombudsman would identify longer-term problems within the sector as a whole and work with the government to recommend action to mitigate any impact before it causes further detriment to passengers. So, as I said at the outset, Mr. Speaker, these proposals alone do not represent an immediate solution for the mess that the GTR franchise is in at the moment. But I do believe that they represent a practical way forward to change the dynamics within the rail industry when something goes wrong and our train travelling constituents lose out first, last and most. And I appreciate above all that most of our constituents are primarily concerned with being able to use a reliable rail service that gets them to work, to school, to college, to hospital appointments and home again at roughly the times that they anticipated, and that compensation for an unreliable service is secondary. They're also not terribly interested in apportioning blame for the problems at the moment. They just need a service that works when they need it to work. But I don't think these two things are mutually exclusive. And I believe that the measures in my bill are long overdue and will help to achieve both those objectives, and I therefore commend it to the House.
Here. Order. The question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. As many as have that opinion say aye.
Aye.
On the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Who will prepare and bring in the bill?
Sir Nicholas Soames, Sir Peter Bottomley, Miss Harriet Harman, Maria Caulfield, Nusrat Ghani, Peter Kyle, Hugh Merriman, Chris Philp, Henry Smith, Caroline Ansell, Caroline Lucas, and me, sir.
Tim Loughton.
Rail Ombudsman Bill.
Second reading what day?
March the 24th, 2017, sir.
March the 24th, 2017. Thank you.